Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with the next panel. This is a panel that is titled AI and Law, and there are many ways that we have decided as a group to intersect these two topics along multiple dimensions, from target sourcing and diligence and drafting to thinking about valuation and finance. We're going to particularly think about sort of how AI is playing a role not only from the participant in M&A perspective, but also from the standpoint of a deal attorney and an M&A attorney, and to what extent are people starting to rely more and more on it or pushing it away. And I think we're going to find some variation in this panel as well. In addition, sort of thinking about how sort of various types of regulatory clearance, CFIUS, HSR, and so forth have interacted both in the AI space, in the industry, as well as sort of thinking about those compliance tasks as well. All right, I am going to introduce from right to left. Let me see if I can do this in the right way. We're going to start with David Emanuelson, whose work is in antitrust and M&A. Let me find his bio. I can't even find your bio. Arnold Porter, awesome guy, and I don't know what happened to it. And is also a chair of the City Bar's task force on A&I and M&A. That is how David and I got to know one another. Next is Jens Frankenreiter, and Jens is a professor at an associate professor at WashU St. Louis, teaches and does research in M&A, corporate law, and AI and law, including several publications, some of which I've co-authored, so I've got conflicts of interest on them, that use some AI tools for thinking about corporate law, corporate governance, and M&A. Next to him is Louis Liu, the co-founder of Eigen Technologies, a global intelligent document processing provider, which comes in quite handy in a lot of legal applications as well. He is as close to a rocket scientist as we're going to get on this panel. He has a doctorate in atomic and laser physics from Oxford, and he's also done stints at McKinsey and as a leader of the quantitative finance and strategies division of Aileron Partners. And he also does a lot of work about thinking about AI governance from a larger perspective. Next is Marie O. Huber, a former CLO, general counsel of eBay, and an experienced board member and current board member as well. She has served as on boards of both private and public companies. Marie and I got to know each other when she was a leader in residence here at Columbia, probably 4 years ago or so, and was a fantastic person to have in the hallways. We miss her, so it's terrific to have her back. Next, we have Alex Stern, who leads IBM Strategy and Mergers and Acquisitions, and also leads the company's investor relations organization. He is a part of the Lazard diaspora and joined IBM in January 2023. So, Sujit, I don't know where you are. There's another one. And there he served by terms as CEO of Lazard's financial advisory business, chief operating officer, and global head of strategy. And then finally, our other Lena.
Hello.
Lena Teitelbaum, who is a corporate partner and head of shareholder engagement and activism defense at Wachtell Lipton, where she counsels on proxy fights, corporate governance, takeover defense, crisis management, and M&A. I want to say one thing again about David, because I finally did find his bio. And he's previously held multiple in-house antitrust leadership positions, and over decades, chief M&A regulatory counsel and associate general counsel for Intel Corporation and head of antitrust Americas for Novartis Corporation. So thank all of you for being here. This is a big panel, and so I am going to take my handheld mic, and here's how we're going to organize this panel. Rather than giving these guys 6 to 8 minutes to riff on their own, we're going to treat this as though we're at a dinner party and I'm going to float table topics. This is this is almost like the Last Supper kind of dinner party, since we're not.
Because AI is going to replace us,
I
and
think that's
this
probably
is the last
right.
bulwark against it.
So I'm gonna hit each of our panelists with sort of a question that they're going to be sort of the chief water carrier for, but then other panelists are invited to chime in as well. And Alex, I want to start with you. To what extent is AI becoming like a core driver of strategic acquisitions generally in the market. IBM has definitely done some of them over the last decade. And how is it translating into deal valuations, deal pricing? For example, are companies with advanced AI solutions and adoption strategies garnering hefty premia? And what patterns are emerging when we think about
all
valuation?
of this in 1 minute?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, maybe a little
So
bit more.
very quickly,
Yeah.
I don't think I'll shock this room by saying that the scale of the AI opportunity is probably unprecedented. We're seeing workflows being disrupted, business models changing, and industries either facing headwinds or a whole new vectors of growth. McKinsey came out with an estimate a little while ago that said 4.4 trillion of potential growth from productivity was going to happen over the next few years, all from AI. If you look at any of the S&P 500 earnings statements these days or their earnings calls, every one of them, the vast majority of them, are referencing AI as either an accelerator or a competitive moat and establishing themselves versus competition. So it is across sectors. It's not just a technology discussion. So in that context, it is certainly the case that as we look at acquisitions, that other companies look at acquisitions, AI is front and center in the discussion and part of the diligence. Whether the strategic rationale itself or understanding the implications of AI for that company and for that industry. Is it accelerating revenue? Is it enhancing margins? Is it creating a competitive moat? All of which can lead to higher valuations. And by the way, AI, it's not all benefit. There are some industries and companies that are being disrupted from AI as well. The M&A market right now is very active. I think the environment, whether you look at economic environment, geopolitical, depending on the day, but generally stable. Interest rates are coming down. Regulatory environment a little bit more accommodating. So we're seeing a lot of M&A activity, a lot more deal flow than we saw even last year as a company. And I think that's true across the industry. M&A overall is up like 40%. I think if I narrow that down to just AI companies, there are challenges, right? A lot of the AI companies are new companies, nascent market, very high valuations. Venture capital is pouring money. 50% of venture capital now is going into AI companies. And so valuations are very, very high, which makes it challenging from an acquirer as we look at these sorts of companies. From a venture perspective, it makes sense. They have a portfolio. All they need are one or two companies to succeed, and their portfolio is a success. As an acquirer, when we're looking at companies like that, to have $1 billion at risk or $5 billion at risk and have it being a write-off is not a risk that we're willing to take, and most companies haven't been willing to take. So I think we're seeing a lot of minority investments and the use of corporate venture capital, which we have. We have a venture fund that we use a lot to deploy into AI companies, take minority stakes, learn what's happening in the industry, get to know the company, and maybe down the road will become acquisition candidates.
And just a quick follow-up. Do you does this market of sort of AI producers, does it vibe of a kind of a winner-take-all or winner-take-most
Well, I think that's the philosophy of
Yeah.
these venture capital funds are putting lots of capital into a bunch of companies with the idea that there is a winner-take-all or a couple of companies take all. They're willing to incur vast losses, cash flow losses for a long period with the hope that at the end they're going to end up with Google or Microsoft type margins. So for sure there's a let's become a leader, let's put a lot of capital, let's establish ourselves in the market with the hopes that down the road they'll be successful. But there's a lot of these companies are generally losing money.
Louis, I want to pull you in on the conversation here. So like Alex has noted, we've seen a lot of deal activity, both in terms of companies who are going to be affected by AI as users or on some level, company level consumers, but also producers. The other thing that's been interesting here is that we've seen kind of a flurry of I guess people are calling them sort of circular deals, right? Where
the infinite money loop.
Excuse me?
The infinite money loop.
The infinite money
is what we
loop.
call in the venture world.
Wow, that's even better because it's got the word
Can
infinite.
I get in that loop?
Yeah.
That sounds like a great loop.
Yeah, I don't
Or
think
just
I've
catch
ever
some
been.
of the coins that fall out of that loop.
So for those of you who are less aware of this, there have been a fair number of deals involving like OpenAI, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Oracle, AMD, where the parties wear more than just the hat of investor and target, right? That in fact the target may also agree, having received this investment, to then purchase output from the acquirer, or vice versa. There was an era where we had a lot of circular deals. It was around 2000, 2001 that had a similar sort of flavor to it. Is there a reason to think that this is sort of different, that this is a more natural kind of pairing?
Yeah, that's a great point, because let me sort of pare back and start in the venture capital world first about these circular deals. For reference, I'm also a venture partner for a fund called Neo Ventures. It's one of the largest super early stage funds in the Valley. And what the classic Silicon Valley playbook and how you get to scale from, say, 0 to 10, 25, 30 million in revenue quickly is circular deals to begin with. So the idea is Y Combinator, everyone here has heard of, very famous startup incubator. The way a lot of these companies work is that I'm a founder of Y Combinator. I'm going to sell you my software. You buy my software, but to you, you're another fellow founder, you buy it to me. And so this concept of circular deals start at a very young age. Start when they're babies, when these companies are babies. So that notion starts at almost that age, and so you sort of have this not money loop sort of even as these companies are babies, and as they grow larger and larger, you like this becomes more prevalent. Now, the current situation that we're in right now is unprecedented. I mean, the scale is unprecedented. The fact that it's sort of a circular thing, that's been around the Valley forever. That is a classic Silicon Valley playbook for startups. But I think one of the challenges is that I've lost track of how many trillions of dollars at this point. But I think the OpenAI, NVIDIA, Oracle circular deal is in the hundreds of billions that goes around in a circle, right? And what's sort of interesting, and by the way, NVIDIA's results just came out yesterday, and there was like a up and down, and actually there was the up and down I thought was very interesting. But what I think is the fundamental point here is that in order for these valuations to make sense, I think JP Morgan calculated that you need something like $650 billion of annualized revenue in perpetuity, and they only assumed a 10% in IRR, a weighted cost of capital, which right now, this is AI still nascent. I think it's going to be transformative, but it's still nascent, and so therefore the risk IRR should be closer to 20 to 30%, not 10%. I think JP Morgan was very conservative on that. And so if you assume a 20% IRR on the current investment that has gone into these circular deals, that's trillions of dollars worth of perpetual annualized revenue. And the only way that makes sense is if we've achieved AGI. The only way if that makes sense is that we have sustained such a large market labor disruption that we have eliminated so many jobs that we can justify these valuations. And I think that's sort of logic behind these circular deals.
What an optimistic sentiment. Anyone have anything to add to that, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little different. We saw this back in the internet days, particularly the fiber companies, where people were putting a lot of fiber in the ground, hoping people would come. I'd say two differences here with this. One, you have a bunch of well-capitalized companies that are funding this, OpenAI aside, but NVIDIA, Google, I mean, all these companies, Microsoft, that are funding some of these circular deals or just funding this investment generally are still very well capitalized, profitable companies. I think that's different than what happened in the internet bust. And I think two is the demand is already there, right? The fiber that went into the ground, people were hoping for demand to come. And now demand, they're building data centers because they're already at capacity. So there's already a lot of demand. Whether that demand will all materialize in the future, as much as they're building, we'll see. So for me, this is a little bit less of a systemic risk, and maybe more, it might be a valuation discussion, like these multiples and valuations may come down because that market doesn't materialize. But I'm not sure there's as much systemic risk in this, even though the numbers are vast. than we had back in the internet.
I disagree.
Okay.
So I think this is, I agree with the fiber optic sort of
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
I think the systemic point, I don't think we're looking at China at all. So it makes sense that the demand is there if you assume current compute inefficiencies, right? So I was just in Singapore last week with spending some time with the Singaporean central bank, the monetary authority there. And the Singaporeans are very interesting because they genuinely, for a classic standard deployment of using these large language models, they use both American models and Chinese models at the same time. And what they're discovering is that the Chinese models are, 15 of the top 20 models in the world are Chinese. 100% of the top open source models are Chinese. And by the way, they are something like 1 order of magnitude more compute efficient than the OpenAI or Anthropic models. So I agree with you that if you assume the current compute, call it under optimization, I think the demand will be there. But even if you take half of what the Chinese have been able to do from a model optimization perspective, the demand drops precipitously. So I think there's that thing that's not quite being considered yet.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, the demand may not materialize. I just think the consequence of that may be different than what we saw. You'll have some companies that won't survive, but it might not be this massive number of bankruptcies that we hit Lazard when Lazard got to work on.
Let me pivot a little bit to another area where AI has been increasingly sort of penetrating our daily lives, at least as M&A attorneys and corporate attorneys, which is in the practice of law itself. Jens, you do a lot of work essentially trying to use emerging AI tools, LLMs, to analyze, to process, to classify, to even generate the types of legal documents that we see routinely, bylaws, charters, M&A agreements, financing agreements. How useful are these tools these days? I mean, I remember early on you and I were working on a project where we had this fantasy of, generating, an entire suite of, document encodings without having to sort of supervise it very much. That was useless five years ago. Have things gotten better?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the use of these tools in practice from an outsider's perspective. But here's my take. My sense is that these tools have become increasingly powerful and useful and widely adopted, but it's a bit uneven. Where these tools are most useful is for document review, contract review, due diligence tasks, everything that's a bit of a needle in a haystack problem. And the reason ultimately why I think these tools will be hard to stop in these areas is that they just can process so much more information in a much more consistent way than humans ever will. Now, if you look at other applications, I'm a bit more skeptical, or the landscape maybe looks a bit more different. If you look at first drafting or precedent research, my assumption going into this has always been that for high stakes work like M&A, there would be limits to the adoption because the costs of an error are just so high. And then recently I read a survey that there's now more M&A lawyers that use AI for first drafting than they use these tools for contract review. And I was really surprised by that. But then I thought about it, and I think what's happening is that ChatGPT and the likes of ChatGPT have become such general purpose tools that people are just using it for everything, whether it's writing an email or writing a memo or writing your first draft of a MAC clause. And I think that comes with real risks because these tools produce language that sounds very powerful and consistent, and they will give you a consistent answer even if they really get the nuances wrong. And I think there's a lot of there needs to be an awareness, and I think a lot of potential problems can come from the unreflected deployment of these tools. So I think we just need to become more sophisticated ultimately in using them.
There's a kind of an interesting, when you think about law specifically, right, which is that while it is a precedent-based system, our interview with Justice Legros just suggested that those precedents can suddenly change. Eric Schmidt had an interesting op-ed, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago, talking about application of AI in finance and saying, oh, well, there can be these innovations that you've never seen in financial markets, an AI algorithmic approach is not going to be particularly good at taking those on until it gets sort of used to the new environment. That may also be true of law, isn't it? Like where precedents change, where the underlying kind of normative or policy rationales for deciding cases in one way versus another may be evolving over time as well. Is that something you see as a challenge or an opportunity?
Yeah, I absolutely see that as a challenge, and I think we have to take into account that ultimately the tools that have given us all these new innovations, large language models, are at their basis next word prediction tools.
Yep.
And they can only make inferences on the basis of what they have seen in the past. Now, large language models have surprised us with all the things that they can do. Clearly, they're more useful than just generating text. They seem to be picking up on things that we consider like logical relationships in the real world, but we just don't know how far that goes. And without evaluating them and benchmarking them, we will never get a real sense for how reliable that are. And the problem with developments like the ones you have sketched out is like it's very hard to like build a benchmark data set for future developments. So like benchmarking this kind of task is something that I just don't see an easy technological solution for, which is also why then we just have to be careful with what we're doing. Now, I think like it's never a mistake to brainstorm with these tools, but you just have to use your common sense and like really ask hard questions. And sometimes I think the one challenge is going to be it's very easy to produce results that look good and sound convincing with these tools, and then like going back and do the hard work and probing the assumptions and trying to see where the LLM made a potential mistake is requires much more effort than churning out something that looks good in the first place.
Marie, can I buttonhole you on sort of this, launching from what Jens is talking about the use of AI for some basic diligence tasks, or maybe to generate a first draft. That may bear, doesn't it, on sort of the question of where the dividing line is between what the client's in-house counsel might be doing versus outside counsel, right? There, some of those tools, you take IBM, for example. I could imagine, Mr. Stern doing an awful lot of, sort of initial work on IBM sort of M&A matters before going to outside counsel. On the other hand, outside counsel, to the extent that they've embraced this, these tools, they're going to have their own privately trained LLM that's based on a bunch of their precedent documents that may give them a sort of an interesting edge up on certain aspects of legal services provision. How do you see that cutting in sort of, how much you do in-house versus how much you go outside for?
In some ways, I don't really view it as what is outside counsel doing versus what is the in-house team doing. So from a client perspective, you think about what are the CEOs, what is the rest of the C-suite saying to you as a general counsel? How many of you are at an outside firm? Okay, anybody in-house? Okay, so to me, it's a question of both firms as well as the in-house teams need to be using and thinking about how do you use AI. And CEOs are saying the legal industry is one of the top industries ripe for disruption from AI. What does that mean for GCs? You think about this time of year, you're going through your planning, your budgeting cycle. It means that you need to show measurable productivity and efficiency gains. Your budget, you have to keep your budget flat or even decrease it even though your business is growing. You have to justify additional headcount. Like why do you need to hire more lawyers? Why can't you let AI do it? So whether it's for M&A, you think we are talking about M&A. M&A is probably one of your legal department's largest single spend. M&A, litigation, maybe IP, depending upon your type of company. And so it's a question of, let's take M&A. Speed, certainty to close, risk identification, flagging big risk items so that you can surface to the decision makers the key areas of risk and value so that they can get the deal done faster, especially if you're in a competitive situation. So I would say it's not so much like, is the law firm using AI, but it's also, is your in-house team using AI? And I think people have this big debate among lawyers. Is AI going to make lawyers obsolete? I don't think that's the debate. Strategic value, judgment, experience, that's never going to go away. But even on the most complex cross-border deals, you have a significant portion of the work of that deal that could be helped, speeded up, clarified, synthesized more quickly with AI tools. Now, of course, you always want to have the appropriate supervision. What are your QC protocols? Where does it really pay to spend the thousands of dollars per hour for the expertise and the judgment? So that to me is a question.
Can I follow up on that? Because I think there's so I teach a class, Jens and I have actually taught it several times on machine learning, AI, and law. And the last time we taught this class, we brought in a legal tech provider to basically show off for the class, right? To show us their tool. It was a due diligence tool, and they were combing through hundreds and thousands of employment agreements to try to determine how many of these employment agreements have a covenant not to compete, right? That would be a relevant thing to be looking for.
Especially in California.
Yeah, particularly if they're unenforceable in California. Or maybe under the at least short-term FTC approach, right? So he ran the tool and then proudly showed us a table in which every line on that table, you remember this, Jens? Every line on that table had, okay, here's this contract, here's the clause. And it would essentially excerpt the clause. And I remember looking down at it and it's like, wow, it has nailed every single one of these things. It hasn't come up with a single erroneous tag. At which point I started thinking, if I'm a second-year associate who's relying on this, there's a good chance I'm going to get fired, right? Because what this underlying classification tool had done, probably for marketing reasons, is has dialed down the false positive rate, but in the process, the false negative rate, the ones that were missing, simply just didn't come up. And one of the things that was kind of odd is that while this tool was adjustable to sort of, on your trade-off between false negatives and false positives, you had to go like 7 lines deep into the architecture to do it. And so that seems like a significant risk that a lawyer who's using AI and is not really aware of the underlying architecture of the classification algorithm might end up just being led down a kind of a path to ruin.
Yeah, I think this is where how you train young lawyers, right, Lena, and how if you're in that seat and you're that young lawyer, what do you need to be thinking differently about your career? Right, the classic traditional apprenticeship model of law firms, investment banks, whatever. And so how do you sort of retool yourself so that you can be adding value and really embracing and using these tools, but also understanding like where are the gaps or where are the potential weaknesses? And then how do you build up that judgment? And some people say, oh, it takes the reps, like you have to see it. I would argue you don't have to be spending the hours of mind-numbing diligence locked in a conference room with boxfuls of documents. You don't, right? But then what does that mean for you? So where it took hours and hours for an associate to produce a due diligence memo, now you can do that in 20 minutes, right? But then what does that mean about what you need to be able to learn for what action that means next for the deal? Or what does that mean for the value of the deal? What does that mean for your next negotiating step? And so really trying to understand like the so what of the question and the now what of the question?
I think Louis and Jens both wanted to chime in here.
Yeah.
Why don't you start, Louis, then Jens?
Yeah, so I want to sort of add on this, right? I think in terms of a skill set for a young lawyer, I think one skill set, going back to this exact diligence example, because actually this is what my last company did as well, which was called Eigen, which I sold last year. But what was around is around AI governance. I think understanding the mathematical tools, or at least the language, you don't need to understand the statistics, but understanding the broad basis of model management and AI governance, I think is a really important skill set for young lawyers as you're going to use AI tools more. And let me give a very explicit example. So my last company, Eigen, we processed more than half the world's financial contracts. We served half the world's largest banks, processed $100 trillion worth of financial contracts, 3 times US GDP. And we were the first AI vendor to have gotten regulatory approval by the Federal Reserve and FDIC to be able to process these contracts without human intervention. Now, like to your point about how do I get a bank's legal department, how do we get Goldman Sachs to, and, you know, Goldman was our first client, how do we get Goldman Sachs to be comfortable taking taking all of these questions answered from this ISDA agreement, or this credit agreement, or this SPA, or whatever, and submitting that to the regulators, you know, for reporting. And I think one of the things that, you know, I don't want to go through the technical details, but one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in terms of the false positives, negatives, and all that stuff, is really constructing a product and a system where the lawyers were able to feel comfortable, and then the regulators eventually were able to feel comfortable with, there's a very explicit process in which, you know, every question gets sort of checked by the machine. There is a process in which the machine gives it a confidence score. There's a process in which it's double checked against a couple of other models. There is a rules-based, non-AI-based process that checks a date is a date. Counterparty is in the database, whatever it is. And then there is, and if all else fails, there's a human in the loop process. So I think understanding the architecture of model governance is probably one of the single most important things a young lawyer, especially a young lawyer who's looking at, have to diligence a large sample of documents, something they need to learn.
Jens, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I had a very similar reaction to you, Louis. So I think there's 2 translation exercises that need to happen. We've talked before about the power of these tools, but I think that's only half the story. One important thing that needs to happen is that these tools are integrated into workflows in-house, but also inside law firms in a way that makes sense and in a way that takes seriously the flaws that these products always will have, or at least the assumptions that they make. So for example, if we have a tool that mostly churns out clauses that look like they really hit, then maybe you might want to run some additional checks to see whether you might have missed something. And understanding that requires you to understand some basics about the architecture. But I think there's also a second translation exercise that in a way is maybe even harder. You've also alluded to that, but I think a lot of the vendors of these tools come to this business from a CS perspective. Yes. When they build the tools, they're more interested in maximizing some common metrics like F1, like you try to get your accuracy as good as possible. But from the perspective of a lawyer, maybe you don't really care that much about precision. You want to make sure that all the potential candidate documents are in the sample that you ultimately review. And if you have a couple of things that you later need to cross out, that's much more okay for you than missing some important clauses, basically the example that Eric alluded to before. So I think, in a way, one of the challenges that we're facing to fully exploit the potential that technology has here is we have to learn how to speak to each other in many different ways. Yeah.
So I now want to get our outside counsel involved in this. This is the moment, and I'm going to start with you, Lena. I know you wanted to chime in on this, but I'll also kind of tee this up because Wachtell is a firm that has not leaned in some ways leaned out of using AI tools. And I think in some ways that is not just due to tradition, but also a kind of a philosophy of how you grow these kind of intuitions in a young lawyerly brain. What does an M&A attorney actually do after all? What's your thought?
Well, first of all, Oh,
You're good.
I'm good. I love being on this panel because I have no business being on this panel. This is, like, I am the token human Luddite on this panel. Basically here to utter, I'm not going to be replaced. It's still going to be okay, right? And looking at you guys for affirmation because, you know, yeah, we're closer to the typewriter than the AI tools. That I can, you know, that I can say. I think there are more typewriters at Wachtell Lipton right now than large language models. That's what they're called. And I say this, and it's amazing because, you know, we obviously have this apprenticeship view of law. It's a trade craft, it's an art, not a science. It's almost like the opposite of what we're saying, and it comes up in so many ways. And so when I was trying, you know, the only time I use ChatGPT is to come up with jokes on panels I'm doing. That's actually my only current use case. And perhaps I might tell you the concluding joke I came up with at the end of the panel. You know, I did this, okay, oh gosh, I have to talk about AI. And I go on X and I see that there's this viral tweet about a markup that was sent by one law firm to another law firm. And here is what it said at the end of the markup, and this has now gone viral. It shows up in blue as new added text to the markup. Quote, if you want, I can also create an even more aggressive stance on these terms, Kirkland style, with more obscure precedent and less adherence to what's market. Dash, perfect for maximizing your client's position. Do you want me to do that next? I love this, not only because it's a little bit, you know, throwing shade on one of our peer firms, but it led me to...
Wachtell has no peer.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. And I think that even this idea reveals a lot. The idea that markups could be aggressive, right? That part of what you're doing is saying, look, you know, we can ask for something that you get 100% of the time, or we could ask for something that we're only going to get 50% of the time, or we're going to ask for something that nobody ever gets, but we're going to be so tough and we're going to do it. And what's interesting about the meta of it all is I think that the prompting in and of itself may start to play a role maybe in litigation or maybe even in how contracts get interpreted, because you know, there is a place for intentional vagueness, right? And there's a lot that gets negotiated where you, in fact, don't want to write out the thing. You don't necessarily want a meeting of the minds. And if I put in to my LLM, write me a provision that makes sort of obscure whether or not getting no FDA approval on this drug can be an MAE, that's maybe not something you want to be doing. Whereas in the darkest places of my heart and my mind that under oath, you know, I might conveniently forget, you know, it's something, and I guess I just want to make maybe one more observation about, you know, efficiency and speed and all these things that of course we want lawyers to be, and we are so fast, But you know, I think about, even just when you know, a lot of you are law students, I see some people who might work at Wachtell, I'm sure you're worried, don't worry, it's all gonna be okay. It's, you know, you say, okay, you know, what's the fastest way to getting a deal done? So someone sends you a 100-page contract, and let's say we know there's gonna be 10 issues. We know there's gonna be 10 issues. So I decode the contract, I make an issues list, I talk to Marie or Alex, and I say, what is your position on these 10 issues? And someone might say, surely then you will take those 10 perspectives and talk to the other side, and when there's agreement on those 10 issues, you will then put it in your document, and voila, an M&A agreement is born. But that is not what we do. We say, thank you for your 10 issues. I'm gonna put it into this document. I'm gonna send it to the other side, and the other side is going to decode the document for an issues list for their client. And we're gonna do this back and forth for days, and we're not gonna sleep, and we're gonna drink coffee, and it's gonna be crazy, and we're gonna be in a room with the boxes. And for what? And I would venture that the for what is this ultimate human arrogance that if I just told you my 10 issues, I'll probably get, you know, some middle of the road answer on them. But if I work it in there, and sure, another good lawyer will maybe catch all 10, but maybe not. Maybe they'll only catch 9. And so it's different to work it into the document versus just telling you. So there is inefficiency by design because you believe it's a craft, You believe that you being clever can actually achieve a good outcome for your client.
I am coming back to you on that joke, but David, if you would like, you could follow up on Linus, possibly with a more aggressive stance. Would you like to do that?
Absolutely, and not even through ChatGPT. It's actually what I believe. And granted, we're in different practice areas, but I couldn't be more diametrically opposed to my use of AI, right? So, and I'll start first with the before a deal even happens. So you get staffed on a case and you say, okay, these two companies are thinking of doing a deal. Are there any antitrust issues? Before, I would get an associate, I would flounder around with Google, I would try to figure out everything I could find about the two companies based on public information. That would take me a long time, and ultimately come up with a decent work product that we'd cultivate and create a memo. Now I just put the two companies into an enterprise version of an LLM, maintain client confidences, and it spits me out almost 90% of the memo that I could have created with all that effort. The best example, I think, is in the pharmaceutical industry, where all of the clinical trials are public. And so if you want to figure out where there's pipeline competition, before you'd have to scrounge around clinicaltrials.gov and get the entire pipeline. Now ChatGPT or its equivalent will be able to do that for you. So to the extent your practice relies on an assessment of public information, that is just a slam dunk way. Now, once you actually need to, a deal is done and you need to get the approval, right? There's this question, okay, well, can't you just use AI to write your regulatory filings? Now that's not something you want to do. There is no substitute. If you want a quick regulatory approval, there is no substitute for getting your regulatory lawyers involved in the transaction before you sign. I cannot tell you how many times it's, we signed a deal. Okay, can you get the approval? How long is it going to take? And you waste all that time. So that is much more valuable than using technology. However, I do think the holy grail that will be really interesting to see what happens. Josh Sovin mentioned it on the prior antitrust panel of just how more expensive and time-consuming responses to second requests are getting. Certainly in the litigation context, generative AI is being used in e-discovery. Before it was sort of this clunky technology-assisted review, so you have to have all these humans train the model, and then it spits you out, and you guess and check, and you get to a certain confidence level, and that takes, time and money. Conceivably, you can take a second request, you can put that into a generative AI e-discovery, system as a prompt, and it will spit out the responsive documents, right? Whether companies would be willing to do that, I'm sure you, the technologist, would have lots of issues with that. But that is sort of a temptation, right? We can save all this money and this time in producing our documents to the government, which anyone who's been through a second request knows you don't get the government to move until you comply with a second request. So that's, I think, probably the great appeal of AI in the regulatory.
Let me follow up along the lines of some. I'm going to draw you and lean into a discussion. But one of the challenges that I've had as a legal educator is trying to do both these things at the same time, right? To try to build some baseline lawyerly skills in my students, but then also show them, okay, there are different ways that you can streamline certain things that you do. Let me give you one example of a situation that I'm still trying to figure out in my own head how I would think about it. So suppose I've got an LLM produced, memo or answer to a query, and I want to make sure that it doesn't have hallucinated cases in it. It still happens, by the way. I know the prevalence has gone way down, but I got a hallucinated case last week. How did I know that it was a hallucinated case? Because I spent decades of my life that I am never going to get back, slogging away and trying to organize, like, what do the cases say? What would I expect cases that I've never read to say? Is it even possible in this area that I've never read a case because I've done a bunch of this stuff by hand, right? And so then I sort of think, okay, how do I sort of incubate those skills in a proto lawyer, right? Does that mean that, say, the first year of law school, you just don't do any AI at all, right? You basically say, we're going to do this old school paper chase kind of thing. And then once you've developed at least a little bit of a spidey sense as a lawyer or soon to be lawyer, is that when you want to sort of, march back in? And I don't know whether you have thoughts on this. I find it to be one of the most challenging hurdles that we are facing right now in law schools.
Yeah, look, teaching how to prompt a generative AI system is a skill that all young lawyers need to have. And so that is something that, I think firms that lean into AI and teach their lawyers how to do that will have a competitive advantage because their lawyers will be better trained to really use the technology that's available to them. But of course, there's no substitute for attention to detail. Every time you run one of those queries, you get the sources. You have to check the sources. I mean, that's just a given. But you're still saving so much work on the front end by getting that initial kind of readout.
Yeah, I mean, I really, it's like describing like a living nightmare if all law firms are now just trying to train people to prompt as opposed to like giving students and lawyers the sense of how words have nuance and directionality. And so like, I'll give you this example, which by the way, this is something I'm not sure I even know the answer to, but I remember I was once, I sent a markup to a partner and it was an indemnification agreement. And it said, and it says, you will indemnify, okay? And I added the words, because I saw it in a lot of different precedents, to the maximum extent permitted by law, you shall indemnify. I was like, look at me, I'm stretching it. You're gonna do to the maximum. And this partner, he got very upset with me and he said, why would you put that limiter there? I was like, limiter? Okay. Oh, I remember this, okay? This really messed with me. And as he read these words, it's like, without it, it's just an unqualified you shall, and with the limitation of law, and okay. So this, I lost sleep over this. And I share this to say, like, the real art and the real challenge of what we do is when you look at an associate and you can tell that they don't quite understand which words have helped, which words have harmed. So if you're just trying to perfect prompts to create a document versus what we actually do and how we actually add value, which is to strengthen and weaken concepts through the use of words, I actually would very much worry about the state of the legal profession.
Actually, there's a philosophical point here. I think I really resonate with what you're saying, Lena, because what effectively what prompts are is layers of abstraction, right? So like effectively, what we're doing with LLMs and prompting is we're saying, generate this NDA, and these terms and be market standard. That is a abstract idea, which then generates and then sort of generates the NDA. And I think what we are doing in general as societies, we're adding layers and layers and layers of abstraction. Similar to management, right? You have your junior analysts who report to the associates, who report to the MD, and eventually reports up to the CEO. Every layer that goes up, you're abstracting something, you're synthesizing something. And I think what you're saying, Lena, is that if we're always dealing with the really abstract layer up here, we're really losing some of the texture down here that actually might be what's really important for flag and risk, or really important in terms of how this contract might sort of be executed in real life.
Basically, in short, it's like, is law like being Picasso? Like, do you need to do the landscapes before you can do the abstract? And I actually, just to be clear, I don't want to make it seem like I will never use an AI tool in my life. Of course I will, if someone shows me
Someday.
how. But I would just say that there's a lot of things that I will be happy if no one ever has to do. There's a lot of tedium, thoughtless, like, you don't have to change every diaper to have your kid to love you, okay? I hope a lot of parents agree with that, because I don't change a lot of diapers, So that's the point. You don't have to do all of the tedium, but there's nuance and there's detail. And I think we could do away with a lot of detail while still trying to build the building blocks of nuance.
Yeah, so I'm more of a Bob Ross than a Picasso type person, but
The better artist.
One thing that there's an intersecting point that is something that's happening right now in law firms that I would like your takes on, but also, Alex and Lewis sort of kind of from the other side. So a lot of these law firms that have decided we're going to lean into some provision of AI have also simultaneously been talking about potential types of restructurings of law firms, right? So in the management services organization, or MSO type of a model, in which outside non-lawyer capital would be effectively invested in the non-law side of the firm. It would essentially be cleaved into the lawyerly stuff, and then all the other back office, HR, payroll, IP management, and information technology is often looped in there as well. How's that going to work if what information technology is doing is running a private LLM that is basically asking the folks on the lawyer side, continue to feed us documents so that we can train this LLM, that we're going to make a chargeback when we sell these services back to the lawyer. I almost wonder whether a young partner and associate's going to think, well, I don't want to be training this thing that's basically going to, sort of steal my, or not steal, but assimilate my expertise, and then make the law side of the firm pay to get that back. How much are you starting? I mean, a lot of people are having these conversations about the MSO structure. How widespread are they? Are these the types of risks? Both from like investing on the tech side, right? Like there's a lot of interest from private capital sponsors to try to invest in this. How big of an issue is this going to be as we go forward? Like the combination of the MSO structure and AI. That was like a cold call question for anyone who wants to take it.
I mean, we have like no back office things, so you just listed a lot of departments I wish we added, so that I defer to.
Can't outsource typewriters.
This is actually a conversation I have almost every day, actually. So a little bit of context. So after I sold Eigen, I started a new company called Twin One AI. We're trying to create digital twins, AI simulations of individual lawyers. And our
I'm his model.
What?
I'm his first model.
And our hypothesis is exactly to this point. Our hypothesis is that there's two worldviews on AI. There's a Sam Altman worldview of AI, which is AI is a centralized machine that sucks up our brain, and it fires all of us, and capital accrues to very, very, very few. And I think that actually bluntly takes the world down a very dark path. Then there's the other view of AI, which is a decentralized AI, which is that back to Lena's point, that individual experiences and individual context matters for that experience of that lawyer. And that what you want, in order to get human lawyers to be motivated to do the best client service and the best client work, what you want is to not have this centralized machine that sucks up all of their brains, but to be able to scale the expertise and the experience of the individual lawyer with AI. And interesting, in our conversations with law firms, I've noticed is that there's a cultural difference. So in some law firms that are pure lockstep, they love this idea of my startup. They're like, oh, this is great. We can all be transparent. We have a network of digital twins, and we can compound knowledge. 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. And I think in law firms that are much more eat what you kill culturally, what I've noticed is that they're like, oh, this is amazing. I can only have my digital twin connect to like 5 other people. We can create these silos. So it's a really interesting phenomenon I'm seeing in terms of, how do you motivate human lawyers in terms of, and how do you value their knowledge and expertise, and whether you want to centralize it and have it like a corporation or maintain a partnership.
Great. We're going to have a few minutes for questions if people have questions from the audience. If you do, please just stand up the mic, and that'll give us a sense. David, have you seen much activity on this MSO type structure? I mean, it's been all over the news, and I expect a lot of people have been talking about it.
Yeah, I read your article. It blew my mind. I haven't been a partner at a law firm long enough to really understand the business of law. But I know that clients view all this stuff as overhead. So from a law firm perspective, you got to have the right economics.
Yeah, if I could jump in from the client perspective, obviously we want the expertise and the judgment and the years of experience to be synthesized in that nuanced, complex way. But we're under tremendous pressure to be growing our business and not to be growing our legal fees and budget. And so whether it's through these MSO structures, and in some ways it's no different than decades ago, law firms had different offices to handle subsidiary maintenance or other things, or IT, right? And so you could say it's not any different. And yes, there are issues around segregation of data and privacy and confidentiality and all that. But the end of the day is when we want legal services from whoever it is, and this is where, like, competition is good, right? Maybe you could say the legal services industry does need to be disrupted, and this is one way to think about it. And if you're at a company, you know, legal services is not it. You're the cost center. You want to be innovating, you want to be building and developing cool new products or services, and this is just a means to an end. So however that gets done, so long as there's adequate quality and privacy and governance and ethics and it's done responsibly, I don't think it's an either or. You can still have the very nuanced, complex judgment, but I would argue that most general counsels do want to see this innovation and change in the legal services industry.
Legal services isn't it, but it might be IT. All right, sorry. That was a ChatGPT joke. Go ahead.
All right, so we're almost in final season at the law school, so I have issue spotters and stuff on my mind, but I actually want to ask a policy question. So right now—
Did ChatGPT write this question for you to ask?
No, this is all me. This is all me. It's about national security, actually, and saturating the world with AI, American AI infrastructure. I hear a lot about the AI war with China, and they don't share the same value we do for human rights, democracy, free speech. So I think it's an important question about M&A and the interaction with AI. And to the extent that the success of an AI model relies on network effects and economies of scale, which you often get through M&A, to what extent, if you were like the policy czar of the US, would you loosen guardrails on M&A to counter the threat from China's AI Belt and Road Initiative? Because otherwise you might have the NVIDIA, OpenAI, Oracle infinite money loop be replaced by, insert the Chinese equivalents, Huawei, Alibaba, ByteDance, Baidu.
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, this does get bandied about generally in antitrust circles, but the AI dimension of it may ratchet it up a notch. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'll start, and I think this. Even if you're not an antitrust lawyer, this is a great cocktail party question, I guess, or happy hour. Probably we're old, say cocktail parties. I think Professor Kahn said, we need to be watching out for AI. There's all these partnerships. There's, this is sort of the next thing that we really need to be taking a look at. To me, all of that is just a clear indication that competition is so healthy right now in this space. There's not one dominant company. There's well-capitalized companies. I mean, I don't know if the network effects right now, this isn't like a situation with search or social media where you have such network effects that you're just going to have a single winner. It doesn't seem like that to me right now. I mean, I will say the semiconductor environment, which I've spent most of my career on, is more competitive now than it's ever been. It couldn't be more vital to national security, and we have a lead, and we need to keep it. And a lot of that has to do with the manufacturing side, which I do a lot of work in. If two major foundational model companies wanted to merge, and that you had to make an argument that is essential to national security, such that the competition enforcers need to take a back seat. That's a tough argument, right? I mean, actually, Professor Kahn, when she was at the FTC, had a really, really famous speech about Boeing, about how that actually was something that, in hindsight, was a mistake. So, creating national champions through consolidation is something that you definitely have to look really closely at.
We got time for one more question. John Coates.
Sure. I'm going to just give a set of facts ChatGPT told me, and then ask whether you guys have heard something that was told to me recently. So the facts are, current world GDP is 173 trillion. In 1970, it was 140. Sorry, it was 140 trillion less than that. So we've grown world GDP 140 trillion in our lifetime, Derek. So a couple trillion, I don't know. Like, that's my observation. I can imagine that from AI. Here's the thing I'm wondering if you guys have heard. I asked whether, because this is the way I learned at Wachtell what contracts mean, was listening apprentice style to older lawyers. So couldn't you take a transcript of negotiating sessions and use it to feed an AI? And I was told no. They've tried, and what they get is, like, at least under current use, current models, and maybe this will change in 10 years, but under current models, what you get out of that is sufficiently flabby that it's actually not a good teaching mechanism. So I don't know whether any people agree, disagree, whether that was asserted to me vehemently by somebody in the industry, but they could be selling their book. So.
So we're actually actively trying to work on this particular problem because we're trying to create, simulations of individual lawyers or bankers or consultants. You're right. I think it's right insofar as if you just take a bunch of transcripts or your emails or your messages into a large context window, or you run something like RAG on it, you will get something that is mushy. It might be a very close approximation, but when you drill down, it's going to get either hallucinatory or it's going to get not very precise. There are techniques that a lot of researchers are looking at now, and something we're looking at, for example, is like let's take an SBA for an example, right? So an SBA, when you're negotiating an SBA, you're probably negotiating maybe 10 issues, right? Each of those 10 issues carry a story behind them, right? A email trail, a transcript trail, etc. And so what you can do theoretically is you can say, look, I have the AI ignore everything, but let us really resolve the detail of this one story of this reps and warranties clause through the entire negotiation process, and then be able to tell a really coherent story around that. And then we do it to the next clause, and then we do it to the next clause. So that's a very different way of using LLMs to resolve that issue versus just chucking everything into a context window, which you're right, if you do that, you will not succeed.
Okay, we are at the end of our panel, and I want to first of all thank all of my panelists for showing up. This has been a fascinating discussion, great dinner conversation with really terrible food, but food for thought was fantastic. Lena, what's the joke? Tell us the joke.
It's not even that good, so I don't want you to judge me for it because I didn't write this. And I basically said, tell me a joke that will tell the audience that AI won't replace M&A lawyers. And it wrote back, I tried. The AI took one look at a working capital true-up and powered itself down. So, like, even AI.
There is hope
even
for
AI
all of us as lawyers.
Too tedious.
You're safe for a while.
Too tedious, okay?
You're safe for a while.
All right, we're going to come back for our last panel. Professor Lund will be chairing that. We'll be back in about 12 minutes, okay?